So it was the last week in May, I think, that my family and I went up to Montreat, North Carolina, just for a week of vacation. And I was really pushing for that week of vacation because I'd been to Montreat twice with the youth group, with the high schoolers. We went for a youth program or a youth conference, and each time we went there, it was just perfect. Just picture perfect weather. You know, the type of weather when you go up in the mountains and it's low of maybe 80s, low 80s during the day, dips down a little bit at night, and just, clear skies. It's perfect for hiking. The humidity is not there. It was just wonderful the 2 times that I went. And so I wanted to share that with Sarah and the girls. I said, we have to go to North Carolina. They'd never been before. And so they said, sure, we'll go. And the week we went was nothing like the 2 weeks that I'd been there previously. You probably had this before. The week that we went, it rained every single day. Okay, actually, that's an exaggeration. It rained every day but 2, the day we got there and the day we left. And that's not an exaggeration. It really did. It was such a stormy week. And I'm not talking a little bit of drizzle here and there. It's the thunder, the lightning, the cold mountain rain, all of that coming. In fact, I think we have a picture. I took one on the first day, which we'll show you, where, it just looks nice. It looks beautiful. You go, oh, this is the mountains. We can go run around. And then the rest of the week looked a little bit more like this, where you're just kind of socked in with clouds. And it's, will be raining. And I caught myself early in the week, as I'm looking at my phone and realizing it's not getting better, it's going to be like this all week, I caught myself really comparing that week to what I wished it would have been like the 2 weeks prior. I caught myself going, oh, why isn't it sunny? This would be so much more fun if we could get outside, and it really kind of put me in a sour mood. But then I caught myself, and Sarah and I had a good talk about it, and we said, you know what? We just need to embrace the reality of what is instead of wishing it was going to be different. Because we're going to enjoy it a lot more if we just embrace the rain, embrace what's happening. And so we watched, I think, movies every afternoon because you couldn't go outside. That's the first time I saw Moana. If we have any Moana fans here, my girls loved it. But we'd watch movies. And then we'd throw on raincoats if it wasn't thundering and lightning. And we'd go jump in puddles and get soaked. And we ended up having a great week. But it was only when I stopped comparing in my mind what I wished it would be and just embraced the reality of what it actually was. And it kind of hit me. I was like, how often do we do that? I mean, how often do we look at a situation or even a person, look at another person, and compare ourselves and our situations to them? And when does it ever lead to good results? Usually, it just makes us feel like we don't measure up when we look at that and compare those situations. As I was thinking about this, I actually thought of several different examples, and so maybe you can relate to one of these. It's that person that we look at that's farther along in their career than I am. And you go, oh, I wish that was different. Oh, maybe we graduated about the same time, but they're so much further ahead. Or that mom that makes parenting look so much easier than it does for me. And you begin then comparing your parenting styles for that person. Or that person at school is a lot more popular and gets a lot more attention than I do. And you begin comparing your popularity. Or this, wow, that person's kids are so much more well-behaved than mine. And you start comparing your kids to other people's kids, and you go, oh, that's not healthy. That's not good to do. Or that person got accepted to a much better college than I did. And you begin just comparing even your college choices and where that might lead you. I just thought, why do we do this? Because it doesn't help us, right? It doesn't help anything. But you know what? We do it, and people in the Bible do it. In fact, we've been doing this story of David, and you'll see in this story that the current king, King Saul, compares himself with David. And what that leads to in his life is paranoia, and eventually the downfall of his kingdom. And so that's what we're going to study today, are the ways that King Saul compared himself to David. But I hope that as we immerse ourselves in this story, you come into it with your own mind of things that you end up comparing and things that you really want to kind of overcome. Because then at the end, we'll talk about some solutions or at least possibilities of how we can overcome this temptation to always compare ourselves to others. Now, before we get to the story, I thought it'd be helpful to give you a timeline of David's life, kind of an overview of where we've been and where we're headed, especially for you linear thinkers in here. And so the first week, we did David's secret anointing. And now the dates are approximate but pretty close, we think, when David was around 10 years old. And this is the story when Samuel comes, anoints David to be the next king of Israel, but nobody knows it yet, except for God, David, Samuel, and David's family. No one knows. King Saul doesn't know. Anyone knows. But at this point, David knows and is going to be the next king. Then last week, David's a little bit older, 12 to 15 years old, and he goes and defeats Goliath. He defeats the giant. And this is something that got him a lot of acclaim in the kingdom. People started looking at him going, wow, that boy, that teenager, just defeated a giant. I want to know more about him. So that was last week. Which then brings us to this week when Saul, because of what he did with Goliath, takes him to live with him in his court. He says, you're done with the fields. You're done being a shepherd. You're going to come live in the palace for a while. That's going to be today. Well, next week, you can see he lives for a while in the palace up till he's about 25. And then after that, Saul finally gets to a point where he tries to kill David. And so David has to flee from him, and he's on the run for about 5 years. Finally, by the age of 30, David becomes king, and he reigns for the next 40 years. So this shows you a little bit of where we've been and where we are headed. But our story today begins right after David and Goliath. It starts with perspectives of Saul. It says this in chapter 17. It says, as Saul watched David go out to fight the Philistine, which is Goliath, he asked Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is this young man? I really don't know, Abner declared. Well, find out who he is, the king told him. Saul doesn't really know David at this point, but he sees what David just did. He saw David go up against Goliath, and so he's going, who is this kid? I want to get to know him a little bit. And so they summon him. In verse 57, and as soon as David returned from killing Goliath, Abner brought him to Saul, I love this next part, with the Philistine's head still in his hand. All right. He said, tell me about your father, young man, Saul said. And David replied, his name is Jesse, and we live in Bethlehem. Well, after David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. And from that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. Okay, there's a couple things going on here that I want to draw your attention to. But the first is that Saul now brings David, who's somewhere around 12 to 15 years old, to live with him in the kingdom. And there's some honor in that, right? There's some sense that Saul wants to honor the bravery that David showed in defeating Goliath. So he says, you're done with the fields, you're done tending to sheep, you're going to come live the palace life for a while, which is a great honor. But there's also, I wonder if you sense it, some manipulation here. Because look at the narrator's words, which I think are really intentional. When he says this, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. Saul wants to keep his eye on him a little bit. I mean, here's the new rising star, the new kid on the block, and Saul's looking at him going, you're going to live with me. I'm not going to let you out of my sight. I want to see what becomes of you. That's the first reaction to David's success over Goliath. But there's a second reaction here as well, and it's the reaction of his son, Jonathan. Now, this is a fascinating one. Jonathan is the oldest son of Saul, which meant that if anything happened to Saul, Jonathan is next in line for the throne. But Jonathan sees David and sees David defeat Goliath, sees God work through David's life, that he knows, all right, God's doing something with David, and he loves him because of that. And in fact, then he pulls him aside in verse 3 and says this, and Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. And Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe, giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. And you might be saying, what? What's going on here? This is a little bit of a strange interaction. But here's what's happening. Jonathan sees that God is working in David's life, and he recognizes, hey, David's going to be the next king of Israel. Now, Jonathan, why would he say that? Because Jonathan is the rightful heir. And who wouldn't want to be king? I mean, think of the power. When you are the most powerful person in the whole country, that is waiting for Jonathan. But Jonathan sees that God is working in a really interesting way in David's life and says, you know what? When God's at work, I don't want to get in the way of it. And so we have this little ceremony here, this pact or covenant, where Jonathan goes to David, he removes his robe and everything on him that makes him look like the next king, and he gives it to David. And in this secret ceremony, Jonathan's saying, okay, you are going to be the next king. It's not going to be me. You see, he takes all of his own ambition, and in probably one of the most selfless acts in the Bible, he gives it to David and says, God's working in you. And so I'm going to support the work that I see God doing. It's an amazing, amazing act that Jonathan does. And it's the opposite of what Jonathan's father, Saul, does. Saul continues in this way. He said, but whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. And then, when the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul, and they sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. And this was their song: Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Well, that's an interesting song. You see, at this point, this is the victory procession. They've just defeated Goliath. This is an upset that nobody expected when a boy takes down a giant. And so there's the victory procession of them coming into town, and everybody's excited. Everybody wants to celebrate what has happened, and there's enough celebration and joy to go around, right? I mean, Saul is the commander of the army. He should be celebrated. David is the boy warrior who took down a giant. He should be celebrated. But then Saul hears this little jingle that he can't get out of his mind. He hears this little jingle that gets under his skin, and he won't let it go. In fact, here's Saul's reaction. This made Saul very angry. What's this, he said? They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands? Well, next they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Saul compares himself to David. Saul hears the people excited for David. They're going, wow, David's killed tens of thousands, which he hadn't, but it's their way of respecting David. He sees that, and he sees they only honor him with thousands, and he compares himself to this boy soldier who just won this great victory. And it makes him mad, and it makes him jealous, and it leads, as we'll see as we go on the next couple of weeks, it leads to him spiraling out of control in paranoia and jealousy over David. Comparison is what we need to talk about here because it's what we see in the scripture. And it often comes in two forms. You will either compare yourself with someone that you perceive to be doing better than you, and then it'll fill you with kind of resentment and discontentment feeling. Or you'll compare yourself with someone that you think is doing worse than you, and it'll fill you up with kind of pride or a self-inflated ego. Neither path is a path we want to take. Saul compares himself with someone he thinks is doing better than him, and it fills him up with jealousy and a sense of being discontent. Well, at this point, what I want you to notice about what Saul does is he looks at this situation, and he starts with the truth. He starts with something that's true. He says this: they credit David with tens of thousands and me with only thousands. That's a true statement. That's what they're doing. But then he makes a leap in logic when he speaks out of his insecurity, right? When he makes that initial comparison, then he speaks in this way. He says, next they'll be making him their king, which is like, whoa, that's not true. And that doesn't happen for another 15 years. But Saul looks at that, compares himself to David, and then out of his insecurity jumps to this crazy conclusion. And how often do we do that? They just promoted this guy at work. Okay, that might be true, right? That might be a true statement. Well, next thing you know, he'll be running the company and I'll be out on the streets. It's like, whoa, no. That's a leap in logic there. That's not true. Or, that person beat me for school president. Well, okay, yeah, that might be true. That means everybody loves him and hates me. It's like, whoa, no. You're speaking from your insecurity there. We do this all the time when we choose to compare ourselves with others, and that's what we see Saul doing with David as well. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we overcome this? How do we overcome this culture of comparison? Well, I've got 3 ideas for you as we end our time together. The first is this: celebrate the success of others as if it were your own. And now I label Romans 12:15 there, rejoice with those who rejoice. It doesn't say be jealous of those who are rejoicing. It doesn't say be envious of those who are rejoicing. No, rejoice with people who are rejoicing, which means that brings us to an idea that there's enough joy to go around. I mean, we don't live in a zero-sum game where if you win, that means I lose. Your victory means my failure. No, we don't. That's not the world God created. The world God created, there's enough joy to go around. And so that means when you see someone successful at work, even if you wish that person was you, go celebrate it as if it was you. Go congratulate them. Go say, I'm so thankful that you got this accomplishment, because that recognizes that there's enough joy to go around. That's the first thing that we can do to push down comparison, is to celebrate the success of others as if it were our own. Here's the second. Refuse to compare your unique story with their unique story. What this means is that we all have our own unique journeys that God is bringing us on. And I don't really know yours to the extent that you do, and you don't know mine. And so when we try to compare ourselves, it really is like comparing apples to oranges. We just shouldn't do it. And we don't get a good comparison from it. So instead, what we can do is celebrate the collective story that we are all a part of. It's the story of what God has done for us. That's something we all share in. In fact, I loved in the song that Roger and the band did, My Story, he says this: if I told you my story, you would hear of hope that wouldn't let go. You'd hear of love that never gave up. You'd hear victory over the enemy. You'd hear freedom that has been won for me. And you'd hear of life that has overcome the grave. But it's not our life, it's God's life. It's what God has done for us. And that's something we all share and can all celebrate in. So that's the first one, or the second one. And the third one is this: trust that God is doing good work in your life too. You see, when we compare ourselves with others, the natural result is jealousy. But when we focus on the good work that God is doing in us, the natural result is gratitude. God has great plans for everybody in this building. Everybody sitting here right now, God has great plans for. And so if we focus on their plans, we miss what God's doing in us. So focus on the good work that God's doing in your story. Saul couldn't do that. Saul got in his mind what David was doing, and it drove him literally crazy. David could do this. David recognized that he was on his own track, his own story with God, and he just focused on that. So hopefully we can too. Let's pray.